This is the lecture for Sankar Muthu's Justice and Foreigners, Kant's Cosmopolitan Right. So first, this will be obvious when you read it, but just to highlight this, this article is nice because it draws in some stuff that we haven't read in Kant. So he's drawing on, for instance, the doctrine of virtue, which is the other half of that big book we read, The Metaphysics of Morals. He draws on religion within the boundaries of mere reason and stuff. And a lot of this is in the first few pages of the article to set the background and give us some details and stuff. And then a big chunk of the article is about the perpetual peace, which is what we just read. So we sort of fill out what we've just read with some more Kant stuff that we haven't read to get a better picture of the overall thing. So that's part of the reason why we're reading this article. There's lots of other reasons too. And then the only big thing to talk about in this lecture is not really a feature of this article. It's a feature that came up in our discussion of perpetual peace, I think, on Friday. And it's also kind of in the background now that we're moving on to Kant's cosmopolitan stuff. And so, as Muthu points out, Kant has these sort of three levels of right. And I didn't write down the page number, but so, he has internal right or state right or whatever. He has right sort of between states, and then he has cosmopolitan right. And the focus of this article is on cosmopolitan right. And the focus of perpetual peace was mostly cosmopolitan right, and also a bit of right between states. Metaphysics of Morals, the doctrine of right that we read, that was almost all internal right, and then a bit of war between state stuff. So that was state right. And one thing that we can ask is sort of, oh, maybe I can find it in. Oh yeah, so here we go. Kant insists, this is page 31, Kant insists adamantly that the concept of right should be theorized at three conceptually distinct levels: the domestic, the international, rights pertaining to the law of nations, and the cosmopolitan. Kant's political writings make clear that at each level one can formulate an ideal against which actual political practices can be judged, and toward which we should collectively attempt to realize, however imperfectly. Thus, the idea of civil rights applies to institutions and practices of individual states. The ideal against which actual regimes are judged is that of a pure republic, in which public authority flows from the sanctity of the laws and not from our blah, 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 blah. The right of nations, or right of states, applies to relations among states. At this level, the regulative ideal against which present actions should be judged and towards which states should strive is a free federation of states, eventually encompassing all the nations of earth. And then to whom or what practices then does cosmopolitan right apply? So we have these three levels of right, and these three sort of ideals that we're striving for. The ideal of internal right or domestic right is the sort of free republic, the pure republic, with, you can read the long sentence explaining that. Then you have sort of right at the level between states, and the ideal we're striving for is a free federation of states. And then we have cosmopolitan right, which this article and which perpetual peace were about. And one topic that came up on Friday was Kant was talking about intervention in states, and we were talking about if a state has like slavery or something, does that mean it's liable to intervention? And one of the things I suggested in discussion was like, look, if like you don't even have a state if you have slavery in the sense of Kant, in the sense that Kant is interested, because what is the point of the state? What is civil society? Civil society gets us out of the state of nature, and it does that by sort of instituting coercion, which is designed to protect the freedom of everybody. So the only justified coercion in civil society is coercion for the sake of freedom. And of course, slavery is nothing like that. And so if you've set up a slave society, have you really sort of established what Kant thinks is civil society? Certainly you have not established a pure republic in which public authority flows from the sanctity of the laws and not from the arbitrary power of any group of particular humans, because of course slavery is nothing but people being subjected to the arbitrary power of another group of humans. So you don't have a sort of Kantian state if you have a slave state. And so obviously from the perspective of public right, of domestic right, sorry, from the perspective of civil society, Kant would say, no, 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 slavery. But then what do we do when we sort of move up a level to relations between states and to war? Do we still keep the ideal state in mind? Or do we say, okay, forget the ideal for a moment. We have to just take states as they are, including some bad states, and then figure out what the ideal regulation between them is. So it's complicated because on the one hand, as Muthu points out here, even at the level of rights, the right between states, at the right of nations, the law of nations, even at this level of like war and stuff, Kant says that the regulative ideal is a free federation of states encompassing all the nations of Earth. And part of the way for this to be a federation is that all the states have to be federations too, as he suggests in Perpetual Peace. Maybe. I mean, like he thinks that for there to be perpetual peace, all the states have to be federal states themselves. And so, like, sorry, all the states have to be republics. I did not explain that clearly. All the states have to be republics. I guess you could have a non-federal republic. He's fine with that. But all the states have to be republics. And so on the one hand, Kant seems to be saying, even at this level of the right of nations, we should have this sort of ideal in mind of what each specific nation should look like. And so that suggests the answer I was sort of giving on Friday, which is, look, a slave state or something, you can certainly intervene in that. They hardly even have a state. On the other hand, if you think back to some of the stuff Kant said about war and how there can't be punitive war and stuff, part of the reason for that was you have to sort of treat each state equally in war. And I don't know, even as I say this, so like his main justification for treating each state equally in war is that he doesn't want to sort of over punish the citizens of the state. He thinks that's not good. And that's a sort of, that's a kind of cosmopolitan consideration. But I mean, you might think, look, another reason to treat states as equal in war is to say, look, let's sort of forget domestic right for the moment. Let's forget whether any of these states are good or bad. When we're working out international right, we have to sort of assume everybody's at an equal standing and sort of figure out the rules of war for that. And so if that's your answer, then Kant would say, look, even if it's a slave state or something, it still has to sort of have equal standing in the law of nations. It can't be treated lesser or something because, look, it's just not going to be practical if we sort of imagine that all the domestic states are good and then we work out what the law of nations is for that. So how idealized are we imagining the domestic situation to be when it comes to the international situation? It's not very clear. And then how idealized are we imagining the international situation when we get to cosmopolitanism? It's not very clear. I don't know. Like the answer I was giving on Friday, and I don't know, I guess the answer I lean towards is that it seems like Kant is idealizing a lot. I say this because, as he points out in Perpetual Peace, in order to have peace, you have to have every state has to be a republic. So it seems like he's sort of idealizing the whole time. But there is stuff he says that sort of goes in the other direction. And certainly, like, forget Kant for the moment, lots of people go in the other direction. So a lot of the people Kant is arguing against, so Grotius, Pufendorf, Vattel, Suarez, they are certainly saying, look, forget what's going on with domestic right. We're not even interested in that very much. Internationally, all states have to be sort of treated equal at the level of war and stuff like this. You can't have you can't have war regulated by rules that say the good states are allowed to fight the wars and the bad states can't fight any wars and stuff like that. That can't work. In order to have a workable international right, a workable international law, basically, to regulate war, you have to treat states as equal. And you can imagine why that is, because if the international law is based on like who is right and who is wrong, it's going to be a mess. Like who's going to decide that? If you treat every state as equal, which is in practice how things more or less have gone through human history, that's at least like potentially workable, or at least it's more workable. We sort of imagine that each state has a right to go to war under certain circumstances, and this is sort of irrelevant to whether or not what's going on inside the state. And so lots of people think this is how war should be regulated. This is kind of the bedrock of what we call the just war tradition, which is sort of a theory of war regulation that was really sort of beefed up and became canonized in Kant's time by Grotius, Suarez, Vattel, Pufendorf, etc. And so it wouldn't be incredible if Kant had this sort of view. And so it's possible he has this sort of view, which says, look, we're not idealizing about the domestic situation when we do the international situation. And we're not idealizing about the domestic or the international situation when we look at the cosmopolitan situation. So again, it's not obvious which way Kant is going. I don't think Muthu takes a stand here in this article about this. I just mention it because it's sort of relevant to thinking about how are these three levels related for Kant. He's not super clear about it, and because it came up on Friday, and it's probably going to keep